Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for tuning in to a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we will continue to make our way through the book Runnin With The Devil, written by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. We have reached chapter 15. Chapter 15 is called 1984. Let's see what this chapter has in store for us. I'll be honest, by fall of 1983, I had little faith that Van Halen was putting the finishing touches on a masterpiece. I hadn't heard any tracks off the album that would become 1984. I hadn't even heard much positive news coming from any of the band members. As usual, I stayed away from the studio, so I wasn't privy to actual recording sessions, but what little information I did receive was hardly encouraging. For one thing, I was habitually sleep-deprived, thanks to a seemingly endless barrage of phone calls in the middle of the night, a sure sign that the band, along with producer Ted Templeman, had managed to completely up their circadian rhythms. They would work deep into the night or early morning, usually with vast amounts of cocaine and alcohol fueling the sessions, then sleep all day. Then they would repeat the process. I would get phone calls from David or Edward at 3 in the morning, and rarely did the voice on the other end sound remotely sober, nor did it sound particularly happy. Anger and frustration were the norm, with the caller complaining about, well, almost everything, but usually about one of the other band members or the producer. Many times I could hear the sound of equipment being abused or destroyed in the background as Edward laid waste to his own studio. The reason for his anger? I can't say for sure, but certainly the explanation provided over the years is not entirely without merit: artistic differences. Edward had one vision for 1984 and for the direction Van Halen would take moving forward, while David and Ted Templeman had an entirely different vision. Edward, you see, had fallen in love with technology, particularly synthesizers and keyboards, and was adamant that these elements be heavily incorporated into the new album. David and Ted wanted to stick with a more guitar-heavy album, hewing closer to the sound for which Van Halen was traditionally known, and which, admittedly, had served the band well. You can't argue with success, right? This obviously is somewhat counterintuitive, given that Edward was the guitar virtuoso and David was the singer, who would soon become obsessed with cheesy remakes. Again, though, it should be pointed out that Edward was no ordinary metalhead. He had grown up in a musical family, had learned to play the piano at a very young age, and had always been prone to pushing the envelope when it came to writing and performing music. The fact that Ed was the most innovative and interesting guitarist of his generation might seem on the surface to make him an unlikely candidate to write and record an album filled with soaring keyboards and synthesizer hooks, but that's true only if you didn't really know the guy. Edward was thinking way outside the box, long before there even was a box. Doesn't mean he wasn't occasionally a gigantic pain in the butt, especially when he had been drinking or doing lots of coke. But I forgave Edward a lot because he was so obviously the cornerstone of the band, and because, when sober, he was a genuinely sweet and introspective guy. By the time the band went into the studio to begin recording 1984, however, Edward had grown weary of two things: repeating the same formula, album after album, and putting up with David's bullying and bull. Had this been another balls to the walls project, in and out of the studio in just a few weeks, their differences might not have escalated to the point that they did. But over the course of many months and many fights, exacerbated by heavy drug use, their relationship unraveled. Never particularly close, Edward and David became that most familiar rock and roll cliché, a lead singer and guitar player who could barely stand each other. The irony that all the extra time in the studio had driven a wedge in Van Halen was not lost on me. After those years of trying in vain to get them an extended slot of recording time, we had finally achieved it, but at the expense of perhaps the last few ties holding the band together. We were all so focused on giving them the space that they needed to record that it never occurred to me it would be anything but an asset. But sitting in a tight space like a studio night after night, week after week, can do odd things to people, especially when drugs and alcohol are involved. With some bands, these experiences bring them together as they coalesce around a shared vision for the album, the band, and the future. With Van Halen, it was the exact opposite, shining light on all the problems lying dormant just below the surface. All this made my job exceedingly difficult. In addition to taking drunken calls and trying to referee disputes by phone, I would sometimes meet with the guys in my office, discuss plans or other matters for the next tour, and then get a call 12 hours later from David or Edward or Al asking me to cover the same territory all over again. Trust me when I say that there is almost nothing that provokes more anxiety for a manager than the nagging sense that his band is incapable of paying attention to pressing business matters. And this is particularly true for a manager who does not have a long-term contract. So, it was with some trepidation that I gathered everyone together in the fall of 1983 to discuss plans for the coming year. The album was nearly done, and it was time to start thinking about getting back out on the road. Given the stress of the preceding months and the sheer volume of strange conversations I had endured, this particular meeting went reasonably well. Among the topics covered, the possibility of Van Halen entering into the highly lucrative and low-maintenance world of sponsorship. It's time, I explained. Most bands are doing it, and it's easy money just waiting to be collected. All this was true. Product endorsement, once seen as contrary to the very soul of rock and roll rebellion, by this time had become a significant revenue stream for many bands. As one of the biggest acts in the business, Van Halen had the opportunity to greatly increase its income while hardly lifting a finger. "What do you say?" I asked. "Would you like me to solicit offers?" They all nodded in agreement. Done deal, I figured. No-brainer. A couple weeks later, I went off to New York to finalize plans for the tour and to meet with a representative of a large and well-known advertising agency. Together, we negotiated a deal with Spark-O-Matic, a company that specialized in high-end audio products, primarily for the automotive industry. To me, it seemed like a logical fit, and the money was borderline crazy. The band would receive $1.2 million up front, in addition to additional revenue for advertising. In return, all we had to do was put the company's name on some of our licensed merchandise in very small letters. That's it. We didn't have to participate in commercials or appear at trade shows or, God help us, perform some silly jingle. Just give Spark-O-Matic a small piece of real estate on Van Halen's merchandise, in exchange for $1.2 million. The day we completed this deal, after several weeks of negotiation, I couldn't wait to call the band and give them the great news. From my vantage point, this was one of the best deals I had ever negotiated on behalf of Van Halen, second only to the band's recording contract with Warner Brothers. Jane was waiting for me at the hotel when I returned from closing the deal. "How much did you get?" she asked. When I told her the number, her eyes widened. "You gotta be kidding! That's fantastic!" I thought so too, so I picked up the phone to deliver the great news to the band. They were all at Edward's house awaiting my call. David got on the phone first. "Hey, Noel, what's up?" He sounded sleepy, a little aggravated, which wasn't unusual for David in those days, nor for any of the guys. "Guess what?" I began. "I caught a deal for $1,200,000. for a sponsorship. There was a long pause, as opposed to the celebratory yelp I had anticipated. Really? Who's the sponsor? David said. Spark-O-Matic. Another long pause followed by a grumble. Never heard of them. I pressed on. That's okay. You will hear about them. They're a big radio company, and they have a lot of money to throw around. Trust me, this is good. Better than good. It's fantastic. I could not believe that I had been put in a position of trying to convince David that a $1.2 million endorsement deal was a good thing. But that is what happened. Let me go ask the guys, he said. Before I had a chance to respond, David dropped the phone. I strained to hear what was happening, but David apparently had left the room. A minute passed, maybe 2 minutes, before he got back on the line. Either this had been the shortest band summit in the history of Van Halen, or he hadn't actually talked to anyone. Either way, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Noel? Yes? We don't want the deal. A wave of nausea swept through my body. I got lightheaded. David, I began, trying not to sound like someone who wanted to reach through the phone and strangle him. Think about this for a moment. This is an incredible offer. We're talking about $250,000 per person, and you don't have to do anything. Yeah, I get it. We're not interested. Well, what exactly are you interested in, David? I mean, we want to make money, right? Not like this, he said. You want to get us a sponsorship? Fine. Make it Marlboro or Levi's. Otherwise, it's you. You? Really? This was pig-headed even by David's standards. Suddenly, the most cynical member of the band wasn't interested in making money. David, you gotta be kidding, I said. This is a tremendous opportunity. I'm not kidding, he said. Levi's or Marlboro. Or your $1.2 million. At that, he hung up the phone. I sat there for a moment, dumbstruck. Then I did what any smart and somewhat desperate manager would do in that situation. I called him back. David, I just want to make sure you aren't with me right now. You do understand this deal, right? You heard me right. We're not interested. I don't want to do it, and the guys don't want to do it. I'll speak to you when we get back to L.A. Again, he hung up, and that was it. I let the phone hang by my side for a moment and looked at Jan, who had witnessed my entire conversation, but obviously heard only my side of it. What happened? She asked. David turned it down. He says he wants Marlboro or Levi's and nothing else. With a look of utter disbelief, Jan said simply, You're kidding. I shook my head. Unfortunately, no. Jan got up and walked to the minibar, knowing full well that my next words would be, Please get me a vodka. That night we went out to dinner as planned, despite the fact that we no longer had anything to celebrate. The next day I reached out to my friend at the advertising agency and broke the bad news. He was shocked. We had spent a good deal of time putting this sweetheart of a deal together, and I had basically accepted it on behalf of the band. Not in my wildest dreams did I imagine that they would turn the offer down. It made me look bad, and it made my friend look bad. Noel, this is really unfortunate, he said. I know, I said. We really appreciate all your help. You have been extremely nice and accommodating. All I can say is, thank you, and I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe next time, he said, which was very gracious considering there wouldn't be a next time. Not for me, anyway. During the months that they had been holed up in the studio working on 1984 and calling me at all hours, I came to understand that the band was in a difficult place creatively and personally, but it wasn't until this deal fell apart that I realized it was much worse than I had thought. My band was in trouble, which meant I was in trouble. The serious problem with drugs and alcohol that had been present for years were not only causing interpersonal strife, but in my view anyway, affecting the band's ability to make clear-headed decisions on important business matters. I will always believe that David turning down Spark-O-Matic had nothing to do with his taking a moral or creative stand. I smoke Marlboros and wear Levi's, so everyone else, but rather an arbitrary and self-destructive declaration of power. To this day, I don't know what David said to the other guys in the band on the day I called. One could obviously argue that this is a lot of the manager to solicit and field offers on behalf of his client and not to take it personally when his client says no or otherwise disagrees with his point of view. I get that. It's not like David and I had seen eye to eye on everything over the years, but this was a seismic shift, as it represented, in my opinion, a degree of incompetence, or at least negligence on the part of the man who carried the most weight when it came to band decisions. Simply put, I thought David was being stupid. But what could I do? Sure, we were equal partners in deals such as this, and I was not happy with the idea of losing $250,000 out of my own pocket. But when you got right down to it, I worked for the band. David was my boss, and if he didn't want to endorse Spark-O-Matic, then it wasn't my job to force the deal down his throat. Nevertheless, my suspicion about the fractured nature of the band was confirmed a couple weeks later, after I had returned to L.A., when I got a call one afternoon from Alex. "Hey, Noel," he began, sounding much more charming and agreeable than usual. "Remember that endorsement deal with—" His voice trailed off. He couldn't remember the company's name. "Spark-O-Matic," I said. "Yeah, those guys." "What about it, Al?" "You think we could still get that?" My first thought was, are you kidding me? But I took a deep breath and tried to remain in calm managerial mode. "It's been more than 2 weeks, Al. I don't even know if the offer is still on the table." "Yeah, I understand," he said. "Just give it a try, okay?" Long pause, followed by the kind of compliment Al rarely, if ever, delivered. "You're really good at this stuff, Noel." "I'll see what I can do." I did not ask Al whether he had spoken to David about any of this. Al didn't need David's permission to speak with me about band business, nor to direct me to inquire about opportunities. In theory, Van Halen was a democracy, with all band members holding equal power. In reality, because David flexed his muscle much more aggressively than everyone else, this made him the de facto leader, which was fine until they began to disagree about matters large and small, and with increasing frequency. Whether this was one of those times, I can't say for sure. Maybe David had second thoughts about the Spark-O-Matic deal, but was prevented by his enormous ego from asking me to inquire about its continued availability, so he dispatched Alex to do his dirty work. Or maybe Al spoke with Ed, and together they decided to go behind David's back. Michael, sadly, would probably have been left out of the discussion in either case. So I tucked my tail between my legs and reached out to my advertising friend in New York. "It seems the guys have had a change of heart, or perhaps sobered up," I explained. "Suddenly, $1.2 million sounds pretty good," I explained. "Any chance the deal is still on the table?" "Sorry, Noel," was the predictable response. "Supertramp took it." This really hurt. Whether the offer was equivalent to what Van Halen was offered, I don't know. Regardless, we were out of luck. I called Al back and gave him the bad but predictable news. He seemed genuinely disappointed, and not just disappointed in the loss of a great opportunity, but in the way it had gone down. Unfortunately, I'm not sure he understood what had happened. There was a disturbing undercurrent of judgment in his voice as we spoke, and while he didn't specifically accuse me of blowing the deal, I got the impression he might have felt that way. Again, I have no way of knowing what David had communicated to the other band members about the offer. Communication was beginning to break down along multiple lines, which made my job exceedingly difficult. Incredibly, rather than getting paid for allowing Sparkomatic to put its logo on some of our merchandise, we ended up negotiating with another company to allow us to use their logo. Well, not the exact logo, but a portion of it. There was a company called Western Exterminator Company whose logo included a character known as the Little Man, a dapper gent in a black coat and top hat wielding a very large wooden mallet, which presumably was used to obliterate various types of pests in the greater Los Angeles area. David loved this image and wanted to use the Little Man as a mascot for our 1984 tour. "You think you can get permission for us to use this?" he asked me one day. "I don't know, David, but I'll see what I can do. It's probably going to cost us some money." "That's fine," he said. "I want to be able to use it." So I called the company and I got them to understand that allowing Van Halen to borrow their logo, just the image of the little guy with the hammer without the company's name attached, would be the best possible free advertising. And they gave us the logo for nothing, aside from some free concert tickets. We used the logo for the whole tour. Each night, the backdrop on stage featured multiple images of the Little Man, mallet held high, as if to warn the audience that they were in for one seriously intense show. It was all kind of clever and cute, and I was happy to have been able to help our lawyer negotiate the deal without writing a check. Still, it didn't exactly erase the pain of losing $1.2 million from Sparkomatic. At that point, it was pretty clear that not only was I not on the same page as my band, but they weren't on the same page with each other. Though none of us recognized it at the time, in many ways the band's only remaining hope was the new album itself, not just its performance or critical reception or the tour or its sales, but whether it could remind the band of why they were together in the first place and what made them the best rock band on the planet. That's a lot of pressure to put on any album, but if there was an album good enough to pull it off, it was 1984. By the middle of November, 1984 was essentially in the can. All the tracks were recorded and mixed, waiting to be applied to vinyl and prepared for release. There was just one little problem. A prominent member of the studio recording team, anxious almost to the point of hysteria, thanks to all the cocaine used during the recording process, had confiscated the master tapes and locked himself in a closet in his home. He refused to give up the tapes until they were, in his opinion, perfect, whatever that meant. In the interim, he said, he would have to keep the tapes by his side to prevent anyone from stealing this. Was any of this logical? Of course not, but drugs will make people do illogical things, and Van Halen by now was surrounded by heavy drug users, both in and out of the studio. Rather than engage law enforcement in the dispute, that would only have created tons of bad publicity and possibly endangered the safety of the master tapes. I reached out to a friend at Warner Brothers who had not only the clout to intervene, but also the right temperament for this sort of work, which was akin to hostage negotiation. The master tapes were quietly and safely retrieved, and the album was put into production. No charges were filed, no intervention staged, no employment terminated, as far as I know. I got my first taste of 1984 in early December, and I was completely blown away. I had been concerned because there had been so much drug use and bickering and other complications during the long months of writing and recording. I wondered what sort of artistic and creative toll all this might have taken on the band. There's been no shortage of great art arising from stressful and arduous situations. There's also no shortage of records produced under the same conditions. It can go either way. So when I first heard the album, I was holding my breath. But not for long. From the minute-long instrumental title track that kicks off the album and runs straight into the soaring, infectious keyboard riff that opens Jump, I was hooked. Better yet, I knew that millions of Van Halen fans, and millions of soon-to-be Van Halen fans, would also be hooked. It was brilliant. It was their album, obviously, and primarily, it was Edward's album. That much was apparent, but I gave myself a little managerial pat on the back as well. Hey, my bet paid off. Give these guys some time, pull them off the road, and let them put all their effort into making great songs, and this is what you get. A fantastic album. The downside to all this creative time and close proximity was a band that emerged from the studio fractured and hostile. But, hey, we had a great album. Surely that would be enough to heal all wounds. I tried not to focus on the personality conflicts that had arisen, and instead threw all my effort into working on the upcoming tour and helping to put together a promotional package for the album. It had been 2 years since Van Halen's last studio release, and no one had been particularly excited about that one. This time was different. The band knew they had produced a terrific album. I knew it. The label knew it. As usual, David was more deeply involved in promotion than his bandmates were. Once the album was finished, the other guys would pretty much sit at home and drink and do coke and smoke weed and wait for word on when the tour would begin. David would drink and do coke and smoke weed, but he would do it in the office, and somehow he would actually manage to get some work done. As always, David was particularly interested in the album's cover art. He had a knack for that sort of thing, and liked being involved in the process, which in the case of 1984 was not only complicated, but ultimately controversial. The band commissioned artist Margot Nahas to produce the cover art. Original instructions were sparse, but indicated a desire to have a quartet of beautiful young women dancing in various stages of undress, in true Van Halen fashion. After a period of what I assume was deep reflection, the artist declined to follow those instructions, which might ultimately have led to her being forced to walk away from the project had it not been for the intervention of her husband, who decided to show the band samples of her portfolio. One painting in particular jumped out at the boys, an image of a cherub leaning against the table, eyes gazing off into the distance, a cigarette perched between the fingers of his right hand, and 2 packs stacked in front of him. The painting, her husband would later explain, was her way of expressing her fascination with both angels and devils, and the balance between good and evil. Well, she hit the mark, that's for sure. I mean, a cigarette-smoking, blue-eyed, blonde-haired cherub? It was perfect for Van Halen. The painting was modified for the album cover, which also bore the Roman numerals MCM L XXX IV. It became known as 1984 only after its release. Then we all sat back and waited for the predictable and not unwanted storm of criticism from tight conservatives. There was an uproar in some corners. The cover was temporarily censored and modified in the United Kingdom through the addition of decals that blocked out both the cigarette in the cherub's hand and the pack sitting in front of him. But most people seemed to love it. Moreover, history has been kind to the artist, as 1984 is widely acknowledged as among the most iconic album covers of all time. Obviously, it didn't hurt that the album was every bit as compelling and innovative as the jacket in which it was sold. While 1984 wasn't released until January 9, 1984, the band announced its intentions some 3 weeks earlier, when Jump was issued as an advanced single. It was the perfect introduction to the album, signaling as it did a shift in direction, spearheaded by Edward. The song became the band's biggest hit, and still holds that distinction all these years later, reaching number 1 on the Billboard Singles chart. The song's trademark is a synthesizer riff that Eddie had written a couple years earlier, when he first began experimenting with keyboard effects. I don't think David liked it, and neither did Ted Templeman, but with the studio in his home and a growing need to flex his artistic muscle, Edward became less inclined to bend to the will of his more egotistical bandmate, or to the producer. In the end, David went along, crafted some lyrics that were perfect for the song, and even came up with the melody. So in this case anyway, Creative Tension produced Van Halen's biggest hit single, and established a foundation for 1984 to become the band's most successful album, both commercially, selling more than 10 million copies, and critically, 4 stars from Rolling Stone. There would be 3 more hit singles, I'll Wait, Panama, and Hot for Teacher, and a seemingly non-stop presence on MTV, featuring raucous and bawdy videos. Thanks to 1984, Van Halen owned 1984. From the outside looking in, I'm sure it seemed like we had the world by the balls. In reality, by the time 1984 was released, Van Halen was a band cracking at the edges and on the verge of an epic collapse. And what do you do under those conditions? Why, you hit the road, of course. Well, that concludes Chapter 15. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 15 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.